I'm so glad you're here with me tonight. Before we step into our story, take a moment to get comfortable. Dim your lights, soften your pillow, and let the blanket wrap around you like a gentle cocoon. Listen to the quiet hum of the room, the steady rhythm of your own breath, and let the day drift away, piece by piece. If this calm journey helps you find rest, perhaps tap the like button or even subscribe, only if it feels right. There's no rush, no pressure, just an invitation to return whenever you need peace. And if you'd like, share with me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love to know how our little moments together travel across places and hours. Tonight we wander together into a history both curious and forgotten. Victorian times, a world of gaslight and fog, of whispered scandals and strange comforts. And within that world, hidden behind velvet curtains and narrow London lanes, there were places where change often began earlier than anywhere else. Not all history is loud. Sometimes it is quiet, tucked away, waiting for us to notice. And that is the kind of history we will explore. Slowly, gently, one soft step at a time. So settle in, dear listener. Let the crackle of an imaginary fire keep you warm. Let the cool breeze of the night pass faintly against the window, and drift with me now into a story that may surprise you. London, 1882. The city glowed faintly under the dim haze of gas lamps, their halos blurred in the mist. Horse hooves clattered faintly in the distance, but down a quieter lane, a modest door stood half hidden. Behind it, not scandal, as the newspapers might have us believe, but something stranger, softer, almost ahead of its time. Victorian brothels, for all their reputation, were places where innovation sometimes arrived first. And though society outside wagged its finger, within these velvet-draped rooms, habits were born that the rest of the world would not adopt for years. The first of these was bathing. Long before most respectable homes had indoor plumbing, many brothels installed heated baths. Clients were encouraged to wash before or after visits. Imagine it, a copper tub steaming in the corner, water shimmering golden in lamplight. A wooden stool nearby held a block of soap and a folded towel warmed by the fire. Outside, ordinary families still hauled cold water from pumps, often bathing no more than once a week. But here, twice in a single evening, cleanliness was woven into ritual. And then there was light. While parlours and drawing rooms hesitated, wary of fire and the unnatural brightness, brothels embraced gaslighting and later electric bulbs. A chandelier hummed softly overhead, steady and modern, long before polite society welcomed the same glow. Clients marvelled at it, speaking later of the warmth, the novelty, the daring glamour of rooms lit as no dining room yet dared to be. Isn't it curious? A world condemned as improper was in its quiet way ahead of its time, doing one thing before anyone else, and then doing it twice. First with bathing, then with light. The very things that would later define middle-class respectability were already flickering here in hidden rooms. Picture the scene. Velvet curtains drawn, a faint hiss of gas, the ripple of water against copper, the hush of laughter carried down the hall. These are not the sounds of scandal, but of small revolutions, tucked into corners the world pretended not to see. And as the fire fades low in our imagination, let us step gently from this first glimpse. For beyond this doorway lies a fuller world, colours, textures, rules and rituals that shape the hidden corners of Victorian life, waiting to be told slowly, softly, with all their odd tenderness. The first chapter left us in the glow of gaslight and the warmth of a copper tub, where brothels were quietly ahead of their time. Now, let us linger a little longer in those same rooms, but shift our gaze, not to water or light, but to fabric, colour, and the textures of comfort. Victorian society outside often prized restraint. Parlours were painted in muted tones, curtains were heavy and respectable, carpets were patterned but not daring. Respectability was stitched in browns, greys, and the occasional deep green. But within the brothel, colour bloomed like a rebellion. Imagine stepping through a narrow hallway into a parlour glowing in scarlet and gold. The wallpaper may have been flocked with rich patterns, the drapery heavy with fringe, cushions spilled across low chairs, the air thick with velvet. It was a different world, more daring than polite homes dared to be. And while critics muttered about immorality, decorators quietly took note. In time, many of the colours and furnishings that began in undesirable houses found their way into fashionable drawing rooms. Even the idea of comfort was redefined here. Ordinary households prided themselves on upright chairs, firm and proper, but brothels offered something else. Couches designed for lounging, low tables for ease, thick rugs underfoot. It was softness, not stiffness, and soon enough magazines began to recommend drawing rooms with oriental divans and comfort chairs. Where had they seen them first? Perhaps unknowingly in places of scandal, and then there was scent. Respectable homes might rely on a vase of flowers, but brothels experimented with perfumed oils, incense, and burning pastilles to mask smoke. The air itself became part of the experience. Later, households adopted the same tricks: lavender sachets in drawers, rosewater sprinkled on curtains. What began as atmosphere became everyday domesticity. Picture it. A parlour alive with colour, shadows flickering across gilt frames, the faint sweet scent of rose and smoke mixing in the air. Outside, the fog is grey and damp, but here it feels almost theatrical, warm, indulgent, daring. And beneath the surface, another quiet innovation is unfolding, unnoticed by those who judge from a distance. It is a reminder that spaces often shunned by society still shape society itself. A sofa, a curtain, a scent. Things that later seemed ordinary began in these hidden rooms. So let us draw the heavy curtain closed again, the parlour fading to shadow. Ahead lies another chapter of this world, not of fabric or scent, but of the rules and rituals that governed behaviour inside, where innovation often mingled with strict order. The velvet curtains close behind us, and the perfume of rosewater fades into memory. Now we step deeper into another layer of these Victorian houses, not the fabrics or the colours this time, but the quiet rules that governed them. For while outsiders imagined chaos, within there was often a surprising order. Brothels in the 19th century were businesses, and businesses require rules. There were schedules, routines, and unspoken etiquettes that many clients never realised shaped their evenings. To enter was not simply to wander freely, it was to step into a place with its own code. Imagine a narrow hallway lined with doors, each marked discreetly. The madam of the house was often both hostess and manager. She decided who entered, when, and under what conditions. Some clients might wait in parlours with wine, others in small anterooms until called. Time was measured carefully, like a clock's pendulum, ticking softly behind the laughter. And the women themselves lived within their own set of expectations. They were required to keep appearances immaculate, hair brushed, clothing neat, shoes shined. Many brothels insisted on regular baths, fresh linens, and in some cases even daily health inspections. In a society where most working-class homes lacked even a washstand, this was extraordinary. There was also a curious civility expected of guests. Though newspapers painted lurid scenes, the truth was often quieter. Clients who misbehaved risked being barred. Respect, at least in appearance, was part of the unspoken bargain. A gentleman, madams would insist, must behave as such. Picture the sounds, the muffled clink of glasses in a parlour, the low hum of conversation, the soft creak of floorboards as footsteps followed rules invisible to outsiders. Each action measured, each moment guided, as though the house itself breathed with its own rhythm. Isn't it strange? In places condemned for being beyond the pale, there was sometimes more structure than in the streets outside. Within those walls, innovation and discipline walked hand in hand. Rituals of bathing, rules of civility, routines of health and order. So let us slip quietly back into the hall, the rules still echoing like soft footsteps behind us. Ahead lies another part of this hidden world, not about schedules and etiquette, but about the food, drink, and small indulgences offered within, which themselves often set trends long before polite households adopted them. The hush of rules fades behind us, and now we wander into another corner of the Victorian brothel. Not into parlours heavy with velvet, nor hallways ruled by schedules, but into smaller rooms where trays were carried, bottles uncorked, and tastes were offered long before the rest of the city discovered them. Food and drink were not just indulgence here, they were part of the atmosphere, a subtle lure of comfort. While respectable families still kept dinners stiff and formal, with courses timed to rigid etiquette, brothels offered something freer, softer, more modern. Imagine a table set not with roasts and gravies, but with lighter foods. Cold meat sliced thin, fruits displayed in shining bowls, biscuits sweetened with sugar, and sometimes even foreign delicacies. Oranges, grapes, preserved figs, luxuries for working people, were here offered casually, as though abundance were natural. It was a hint of cosmopolitan living, years before such things became common in the broader middle class. And then there was drink. Respectable homes often poured ale or claret in moderation, but here champagne flowed earlier than in many drawing rooms. Gaslit parlours sparkled with bubbles rising in crystal glasses, laughter softened by the hiss of the cork, the fizz of wine poured in lamplight. Even cocktails, still new and whispered about, sometimes appeared here before they reached mainstream taverns. Picture the sounds, the soft pop of a cork, the clink of glass on tray, the rustle of silk as a figure leans in to offer a plate of sugared almonds. To us, it feels indulgent but ordinary. To Victorians, it was novel, an intimacy of taste and setting that challenged the stiffness of mealtime tradition. And isn't it curious? What polite households later embraced? Lighter dining, shared drinks, even the habit of late-night suppers had already been practiced in these rooms. Twice again, the so-called hidden houses led the way, turning indulgence into innovation. The irony lingers. In places condemned for immorality, rituals of modern comfort were born, and those rituals drifted outward, softened and reshaped until they appeared in middle-class homes, no longer scandalous but fashionable. So let us leave that parlour table now, the champagne glass empty, the fruit bowl gleaming faintly in the glow. Ahead lies another chapter, not of taste but of sound, the music and entertainment that filled these houses, often experimenting with styles long before theatres and salons welcomed them. The clink of glasses fades, the fizz of champagne softens into memory, and now we follow another thread of Victorian brothel life. Not taste, but sound. For these houses were filled with music, laughter, and sometimes entertainment that pushed ahead of its time, long before it filtered into respectable drawing rooms. Imagine a parlour in 1875. The gaslight hums faintly above, velvet curtains keep the night out, and in the corner a piano rests, its keys gleam under the glow. A young woman sits with a playful smile and begins to play, not solemn hymns or rigid waltzes, but jaunty tunes, lively dances, songs that fluttered between folk and cabaret. Guests tap their feet, some hum along, others laugh softly. Outside, such music might have been dismissed as improper, but here it was celebrated. Brothels often hosted singers, musicians, even comedians, creating spaces of informal entertainment. Unlike the stiff concerts and formal balls of Victorian society, these performances were intimate, relaxed, experimental. Songs were shorter, funnier, sometimes daring, and often borrowed from foreign traditions. In a sense, these parlours were testing grounds, little theatres hidden away, where styles were tried before moving to public halls. Picture the sound of it. The lilting rise of piano keys, the sudden burst of laughter at a cheeky lyric, the soft hum of voices joining in chorus. Beyond the walls, London's fog pressed thick, but inside the air was alive with rhythm and warmth. Even instruments told the story of innovation. Accordions and banjos found their way into these rooms long before polite society embraced them. New dances, too, took shape here. The quick steps of a polka, the swaying of foreign rhythms. Later, such dances would sweep through ballrooms, but their earliest stirrings often echoed first in brothel parlours, where freedom allowed experimentation. And isn't it fascinating? The same society that wagged its finger at these houses would soon adopt their music, their dances, their easy laughter. Entertainment that was once dismissed as vulgar would, within years, become fashionable, even celebrated. So as we leave that parlour, the piano notes still echo faintly. Let us carry with us the softness of song, the laughter blurred with champagne bubbles, the rhythm of innovation hidden in shadow. For ahead lies another chapter, not of sound or taste, but of health itself. The surprising ways brothels often engage doctors and medicines before polite families did, shaping practices that later became common advice. The piano notes fade into memory, and now we turn to something quieter, yet deeply surprising: health. For while Victorian society loved to speak of morality, it often ignored physical well-being. But within brothels, health, oddly enough, was taken seriously, sometimes earlier than in respectable homes. Imagine London in the 1860s. In most households, a doctor was called only when illness grew dire. Preventive care was rare, and many families still trusted home remedies more than physicians. Yet, in brothels, where risk was constant, health became a daily concern. Madams often kept doctors on call, required regular checkups for their workers, and insisted on cleanliness long before public health became a common phrase. Picture a small upstairs room, a table neatly laid with bottles, clean linens, and instruments polished in lamplight. A physician visits quietly, making notes, offering powders or tonics. These visits were not whispered about with shame, but treated as routine, an early form of occupational medicine, though no one would have called it that then. Even small habits of hygiene grew here. Sheets were washed frequently, towels replaced daily, rooms aired with open windows despite the London chill. Vinegar was sprinkled as a disinfectant, lavender burned to purify the air. Outside, in crowded tenements, families might sleep in the same sheets for weeks, but here, turnover demanded order and cleanliness. Isn't it curious? In houses society labelled immoral, practices of sanitation and preventive care quietly took hold first. Twice again, they led through bathing rituals and medical oversight, while respectable households hesitated. The sounds are easy to imagine. Water poured into a basin, the creak of clean linens folded onto a bed, the low murmur of a doctor's voice reminding a house to keep windows cracked for air. Not dramatic, not scandalous, just small, steady steps toward a healthier way of living. Later, when public health reforms swept through Victorian London, sanitary laws, cleaner streets, emphasis on fresh air, it all sounded new. But in truth, fragments of it had already been practiced in places no one dared to praise. So let us close the door softly on that upstairs room, the faint scent of lavender still drifting through the hall. Ahead waits another chapter, not about doctors or hygiene, but about fashion itself. The daring clothes, the fabrics and hairstyles that began in these hidden houses, and then, quietly, found their way into society's salons. The scent of lavender still lingers in our imagination, a quiet note of health and order. But now let us turn to something far more vivid: fashion. In the world outside, respectable women were bound by corsets laced tight, skirts heavy with fabric, and colours chosen for modesty. But inside the brothel, fashion breathed freer, daring earlier, setting trends long before polite society dared to follow. Imagine a London brothel parlour in 1878. A woman enters wearing a gown of silk dyed a shade of crimson so bright it seems to glow beneath the gaslight. Outside, such a colour might be whispered about as vulgar. Here it shimmered as a badge of boldness. Later, magazines would begin to suggest richer tones for evening wear, but the experiment had already begun in these hidden rooms. Hairstyles, too, were playful here. While respectable women pinned their hair into neat buns, brothel workers curled, waved, and even coloured their locks. Glossy ringlets, framed faces, hair oils scented with rose or jasmine left a trail of perfume as they moved. Decades before hair salons became fashionable on every high street, these women were already treating hair as art, as personality. Clothing loosened as well. Stays were less rigid, skirts cut slightly shorter, sleeves designed to reveal shoulders or arms. Fabrics clung closer to the body, a softness that society outside still deemed improper. And yet, slowly, these ideas seeped outward. By the 1890s, fashion magazines showcased looser gowns, lighter corsetry, daring necklines, all echoes of choices once dismissed as scandalous. Picture it. The soft rustle of silk, the glimmer of satin beneath lamplight, the subtle perfume of rosewater on fabric. Guests marvelled at these sights, carried the memory outward, and soon enough, tailors and dressmakers felt the ripple. Fashion is never still. It borrows, adapts, reshapes, even from places it pretends to ignore. Isn't it strange? The same gowns condemned for being indecent later became the height of Parisian couture. Brothels dressed for allure, but in doing so, they tested fabrics, cuts, and colours that would come to shape an entire era of style. So let us leave that parlour silk shimmering softly behind us and drift toward another chapter of this hidden world. This time, not about clothing or colour, but about conversation itself. The way brothels nurtured wit, debate, and even politics, long before salons and drawing rooms became known for their clever talk. The rustle of silk fades, the scent of rosewater drifts into memory, and now we find ourselves listening instead of looking. For in Victorian brothels, it was not only clothes and colours that shaped their reputation, it was conversation. Behind velvet curtains and flickering lamps, words became as important as gowns, and often more daring. Imagine a parlour in 1881. A handful of men sit in low chairs, glasses of wine at their sides. Around them, women laugh softly, but not only for charm. They speak with wit, tease with cleverness, tell stories in voices that fill the room with warmth. Outside, drawing rooms and salons prided themselves on intellectual discussion, but inside brothels, the tone was freer, looser, more playful. A guest might confess his fears of politics, or muse about railways, or debate the merits of a new novel. And the women? They listened, replied, sharpened jokes, asked questions. Many were better read than expected. Magazines, penny novels, newspapers passed through these houses as quickly as wine bottles. In an era when women were often discouraged from public debate, here they became conversationalists, performers not only of beauty but of mind. Picture the sounds, a burst of laughter at a clever pun, the clink of a glass set down, the shifting of silk as someone leans forward to whisper a reply. The room hums not with scandal, but with the simple comfort of being heard, of speaking freely, of exchanging thoughts without the stiff rules of polite society. Isn't it curious? The salon, famous in Paris, celebrated later in London, was mirrored quietly in these hidden parlours. Here, wit was valued, humour encouraged, curiosity indulged. Conversation itself became a kind of performance, a soft theatre of minds as much as of bodies. And in time, this looseness seeped outward too. Drawing rooms began to permit lighter banter, magazines praised sparkling talk, and the stiff walls of Victorian conversation began to bend. What was once dismissed as improper wit grew into social fashion. So as we leave that parlour of laughter and clever words, let us carry the sound of it with us, a gentle murmur like waves on a shore. Ahead lies another chapter of this hidden world, one that glows not with wit but with art itself, for brothels were often decorated with paintings, sketches and photographs long before such images were welcomed in respectable homes. The hum of conversation lingers like an echo, but now our gaze drifts to the walls themselves. For in Victorian brothels, art often spoke where words fell silent. Paintings, sketches, even early photographs. These were displayed boldly, long before respectable parlours dared to hang such images. Imagine stepping into a softly lit room in 1874. The gaslight flickers against gilt frames. On the walls hang portraits, not the stern faces of ancestors, nor biblical scenes, but daring works of colour and form. Classical nudes, mythological figures, romantic landscapes, some pieces imported cheaply, others copied from famous canvases. To the visitor it felt exotic, even shocking, but also strangely comforting, like stepping into another world where beauty was allowed to be playful. Outside, most households displayed safe pictures, ships at sea, portraits of family, still life paintings of fruit. But here, the art whispered something different, that life was not only duty but pleasure. A woman reclined in paint, drapery sliding softly across her shoulder. A sketch showed dancers in lively poses, their skirts swirling, and astonishingly, small photographs, cabinet cards, were pinned or framed, showing figures the world outside still found daring. Picture the textures, canvas rough beneath a curious hand, gilt frames catching lamplight, shadows deepening the folds of painted silk. The room became more than walls. It became a gallery, alive with images that blurred the line between scandal and beauty. And isn't it fascinating? While respectable society frowned, it also peaked. Prints of French paintings trickled into London, and soon enough middle-class homes cautiously hung romantic art, borrowing ideas once dismissed as improper. The brothel had been first, quietly, boldly, without apology. Even photographs tell the story. In an era when most families used the camera for stiff portraits, these houses embrace softer, livelier images. Women posed with flowers, laughter caught mid-smile, photography as intimacy as atmosphere. Later, society would call such styles artistic. But here, they had already lived on the walls. So let us stand in that room for a moment longer, the faint crackle of fire warming the air, the painted figures shimmering under lamplight, the hush of images daring to exist. Then let us step back, closing the gallery behind us. Ahead lies another chapter, not of walls, but of sound and space once again. For brothels also experimented with entertainment beyond music, early forms of theatre, private readings, and even dance, small spectacles that would later shape the amusements of an age. The gilt frames fade behind us, their painted figures left in the soft glow of lamplight. Now we follow the sound of footsteps into another chamber, where the air feels alive not with stillness, but with performance. For in Victorian brothels, entertainment was more than music. It sometimes became theatre, a private stage where new amusements were tested long before society admitted them. Imagine a small parlour, its furniture pushed back, its curtains drawn tight. Guests settle with glasses in hand, their laughter subdued as a hush of expectation fills the air. Then, perhaps, a woman enters in costume. No grand gown, but something playful, theatrical. She recites verses, sometimes Shakespeare softened with laughter, sometimes bawdy poems whispered with a smile. The room becomes an audience, intimate and close. The line between stage and seat blurred. In other houses, the entertainment was dance. Not the rigid quadrilles of the ballroom, but lighter, freer steps. Spins and twirls drawn from folk dances, from cabaret, even from foreign traditions. Bare feet tapped on polished floors, skirts swayed, the rhythm carried by nothing more than a piano and the hush of clapping hands. Long before theatres showcased these dances, they were alive here, secret rehearsals for the wider stage. Picture the sounds, the low hum of anticipation, a giggle at a daring line, the soft beat of shoes on wood, the faint applause muffled in heavy drapery. It is not scandal, but intimacy, performance stripped of grandeur, entertainment brought close enough to touch. And isn't it curious? While London's great theatres insisted on formality, these hidden parlours experimented. Here, performers could be playful, could test laughter, could try daring new steps without the judgment of critics. Guests carried those experiences outward, spoke of them softly, and soon enough society began to demand lighter entertainments in music halls and salons. Once again, what was hidden became fashion. The brothel, in this sense, was a stage ahead of its time, not in size or fame, but in spirit. A place where people gathered not only for desire, but for novelty, for art, for glimpses of something freer. So as the last verse fades, and the dancer bows softly, let us slip away, leaving the hush of performance behind. Ahead lies another chapter, not of art or theatre, but of privacy itself. For in a crowded Victorian world, where families shared rooms and walls were thin, brothels offered something rare. The promise of a private chamber, a door that closed, and the luxury of solitude long before hotels and homes made it common. The echoes of dance and whispered verses fade behind heavy curtains. Now, let us pause before another door, one not marked by sound or spectacle but by silence. For in the Victorian world, crowded with families packed into small rooms and thin-walled lodgings, Privacy was a rare and precious thing. Yet in brothels, privacy became part of the promise, long before respectable society learned to value it. Imagine a working-class home in London, 1870. A family of 6 squeezes into 2 rooms. Curtains divide space where walls cannot. Conversations overlap, children stir in the night, and solitude exists only in fleeting moments. Hotels, meanwhile, are expensive, and boarding houses offer no better privacy. A door may close, but thin walls betray every sound. Now step instead into a brothel chamber. The door closes with a soft click. Thick curtains muffle the street. The bed, freshly made, rests against walls draped in fabric. Candles or lamps glow warmly. For the client, and often for the worker too, it is not only companionship offered here, it is seclusion, a chamber of one's own, even if for an hour. The sensation of privacy was itself a kind of luxury. To breathe without interruption, to speak without others overhearing, to move without crowded eyes. It was an experience Victorians outside rarely tasted, yet one they slowly began to crave. And so, in time, respectable society adopted the lesson. Hotels introduced more private rooms, guest houses promised silence, even middle-class homes began to design bedrooms not as shared spaces but as personal retreats. Picture the softness of it. The door closing, the hum of the city fading to nothing, the warmth of fabric-draped walls holding the quiet like a cocoon. No noise, no interruptions, only stillness. It is easy to imagine why such a gift felt almost revolutionary. Isn't it curious? The very idea of personal privacy, which today we take for granted, found its early practice in places whispered about with scandal. Twice again, brothels led before society followed, first with bathing, then with light, now with the idea of solitude. So let us rest a moment in that quiet chamber, the hush of privacy wrapped around us like a blanket. And when we open the door once more, we will step into another chapter, not of silence, but of service, where brothels tested new forms of hospitality, offering comforts that would later shape hotels, restaurants, and even the modern idea of customer care. The hush of privacy lingers in our thoughts, like a closed door in the quiet of night. But now, let us open another door, one that leads not to solitude, but to service. For brothels, in their own way, became laboratories of hospitality, offering comforts that respectable businesses had not yet learned to provide. Imagine arriving at such a house in the late 1870s. You're greeted not with suspicion, but with a practiced welcome. A maid offers to take your coat, a servant brings a drink almost before you ask. Rooms are warmed in winter, cooled in summer, with open windows and bowls of scented water. The air feels prepared, as though your comfort was expected. Outside, in most of London, hospitality was less refined. Boarding houses were notorious for stale food, cold rooms, and brusque treatment. Even respectable inns often served guests with indifference. Yet here, in places hidden from polite society, small touches of customer care blossomed. Clean sheets, warm baths, food and drink at odd hours. These conveniences set a quiet precedent. Picture the details. A tray of biscuits placed on a small table, the faint hiss of a gas lamp already lit before you entered. Fresh towels folded neatly. A guest might even find their boots polished by morning, their clothes brushed and hung. All this in an era when most travellers endured far rougher conditions. And isn't it striking? The modern hotel industry, with its emphasis on comfort, service and small luxuries, would grow in the decades that followed. But many of the habits, personal attention, fresh linens, late-night suppers, were already alive within brothels. Twice again they were ahead of their time. Even the art of discretion was a form of hospitality. Guests were never announced by name, never written in ledgers where others might pry. Privacy and service intertwined, creating an atmosphere that felt safe, indulgent, attentive. Later, hotels would advertise absolute discretion as a selling point. But here, it was already routine. So let us step back from that parlour of soft lamps and polished boots, the echoes of quiet service still warm in our minds. Ahead lies another chapter, not of hospitality but of medicine once more, For brothels also intersected with early practices of contraception and reproductive health, subjects Victorian society barely dared to speak of, yet which quietly shaped the future. The memory of polished boots and fresh linens fades, but the quiet presence of health returns to us again. For in Victorian brothels, there was another matter whispered about, something society hardly dared to speak aloud: contraception and reproductive health. While doctors, churches and politicians argued endlessly, these houses, tucked away behind heavy doors, confronted the issue directly, out of necessity. Imagine London in the 1860s. Respectable families rarely spoke of such matters. To mention contraception was to risk scandal. Pamphlets on married love were banned, and most doctors avoided the subject altogether. Yet in brothels, where health and livelihood intertwined, methods of prevention were openly discussed, practiced, and even improved. Condoms, for example, were used here long before they became respectable, or even legal to advertise. Early versions were fashioned from sheep gut or treated linen, sold quietly by chemists, or distributed through discreet networks. Brothels often kept supplies ready, not only to protect their workers but to offer reassurance to clients. In time, as rubber manufacturing improved, these same houses adopted the newer versions first. Society outside hesitated. Inside, practicality ruled. There were other measures too: sponges soaked in vinegar, herbal remedies whispered from one woman to another, practices of timing and prevention that blended folk knowledge with experimentation. Some worked, others less so. But what mattered was the willingness to discuss, to share, to seek control in an age when silence was the rule. Picture the quiet intimacy of it. A woman showing another how to prepare a sponge, the hushed voice of a madam reminding her staff of the importance of protection, the careful storage of small boxes and bottles hidden beneath folded linens. These were not conversations of scandal, but of survival. And isn't it remarkable? Long before society admitted the importance of reproductive health, brothels practiced it. Twice again they moved ahead, first in using and normalizing contraception, then in shaping the conversations that would decades later reach the medical profession and the law. Even in records of the time, you can sense the tension. Doctors condemned such practices yet quietly took notes. Reformers spoke against brothels, yet drew knowledge from them. In silence, society borrowed from the very places it scorned. So let us leave that chamber now, the small bottles tucked neatly away, the whispered instructions fading into the hush of lamplight. Ahead lies another chapter, not of medicine, but of architecture itself. For brothels also shaped the very design of buildings, experimenting with layouts, lighting, and hidden passages that later found their way into hotels and theatres. The whisper of hidden bottles and careful remedies fades into the dark, and now our eyes turn outward, to the very walls that contained this world. For brothels were not only places of ritual and conversation, but of architecture, shaping how buildings themselves would later be designed. Imagine walking into one in 1872. At first glance, it may appear like any townhouse on the street. Plain facade, iron railings, steps leading to a polished door. But inside, the space opened differently. Parlours were placed to impress, staircases wound more gracefully, and corridors curved in ways that allowed privacy. Doors were thicker, curtains heavier, carpets deeper, each choice intended to hush the sounds of life within. Some houses even had hidden passages, discreet stairways allowing servants or guests to move without crossing paths. In larger establishments, one might find interconnected rooms arranged around a central hall so that activity could flow without crowding. These were not accidents, they were deliberate designs, shaped by the need for comfort, secrecy, and order. And lighting too was arranged differently. Gas fixtures were placed not only for brightness, but for atmosphere. Soft glows in corners, mirrors angled to reflect and multiply light, chandeliers adjusted lower to bathe rooms in warmth. Later, when hotels and theatres sought to create ambience, they borrowed from these experiments, often without acknowledgement. Picture the textures: a staircase polished smooth by careful hands, a wall draped in damask to hush sound, a narrow door tucked behind velvet curtains leading to another hall. The building itself seemed alive, designed not only to contain bodies, but to manage movement, sound, and secrecy. Isn't it fascinating? The very idea of architectural planning for privacy and atmosphere, things now essential in modern hotels, restaurants, even theatres, was rehearsed here first. Brothels taught architects quietly how to think about human flow, comfort, and concealment. And in time, these ideas spread. Hotels boasted private stairways for discreet guests, theatres designed lounges with heavy drapery, and middle-class homes began to divide rooms for specific functions: dining, parlours, studies, each shaped for atmosphere as much as utility. So let us step softly down that carpeted stair, the faint creak of wood beneath our feet, the quiet design lingering in memory. Ahead lies another chapter, not of walls or stairs, but of money. For brothels were also places where new systems of payment and finance emerged, experimenting with tabs, credit, and bookkeeping before such practices became standard in businesses outside. The hush of velvet staircases fades behind us, and now we follow the quiet shuffle of papers, the soft clink of coins. For Victorian brothels were not only houses of comfort, but also businesses, complex ones that often experimented with systems of money and bookkeeping long before other trades adopted them. Imagine a madam seated at her desk in 1880. A lamp glows faintly, ledgers lie open, and a quill moves steadily across the page. She tracks not only expenses, coal, candles, food, linens, but also payments made by clients. Unlike taverns or boarding houses which demanded cash at once, some brothels extended credit. A gentleman might run a tab, returning week after week, settling his account later. This flexibility, rare at the time, prefigured the credit systems that hotels and restaurants would later use. Wages too were structured carefully. Workers were often paid partly in cash, partly in clothing or food, sometimes with small bonuses for loyal service. Records were kept with surprising precision. At a time when many small businesses ran informally, brothels operated like miniature firms, balancing books with the care of bankers. Picture the sounds, the soft scratch of pen on paper, the rustle of coins poured into a drawer, the faint creak of a ledger closing. The atmosphere was not one of scandal, but of commerce. Quiet, methodical, forward-looking. And isn't it curious? The idea of tabs, of itemized bills, of discreet record-keeping, all practices essential to modern hospitality, were tested here first. When hotels later adopted the idea of charging guests at the end of their stay, when restaurants began offering printed bills, they were following paths brothels had already walked. Even secrecy in finance was a kind of innovation. Names were rarely written in full, codes sometimes replaced details, ensuring discretion. Later, banks and businesses would adopt similar methods for sensitive clients. Here, it was already routine. So let us leave that quiet office now, the ledger neatly closed, the lamp burning low. Ahead lies another chapter, not of money but of medicine once more, for brothels played a role in early public health debates, shaping how governments and doctors confronted disease in ways that would ripple far beyond their walls. The rustle of ledgers and the quiet clink of coins fade into memory, and now another sound rises in our story. Not the hum of music or the whisper of silk, but the sterner voice of doctors and lawmakers. For Victorian brothels, whether they wished it or not, stood at the centre of early public health debates. In their walls, medicine and morality collided, shaping policies that would ripple far beyond. Imagine London in the 1860s. The city was anxious about disease, particularly syphilis, a word often spoken in hushed tones called the pox or the secret scourge. Doctors feared its spread, and politicians feared its impact on the army and navy. And so, legislation appeared, the Contagious Diseases Acts. These laws gave police and doctors the power to inspect women in certain towns, forcing examinations and sometimes confinement in hospitals. It was a harsh and invasive practice, one that targeted women far more than men. But within brothels, something else happened alongside it. Many madams, eager to protect business, arranged regular checkups for their workers voluntarily, creating a kind of health routine long before preventive medicine became common for the wider public. Cleanliness, fresh linens, even medical certificates. These were required, if not by law, then by practice. Picture the scene. A physician's black bag set on a table, instruments laid out with care, the faint scent of carbolic drifting in the air. The visit was clinical, sometimes cold, but it represented something new, an institutional approach to health that would, in time, spread into factories, schools, and workplaces. And isn't it ironic? Society condemned these houses, yet depended on them as testing grounds for public health policy. Twice again, brothels stood ahead, first by normalizing preventive examinations, then by showing governments the limits and dangers of coercive law. Out of scandal, reform began. The voices of reformers echoed loudly. Josephine Butler and her supporters campaigned fiercely against the acts, demanding justice for women. Their victories would eventually reshape public health into something more balanced, more humane. But it began in shadows, in quiet rooms where medicine and survival met. So let us step softly out of that dimly lit chamber, the doctor's bag closed, the air carrying both fear and resilience. Ahead lies another chapter, not of health, but of travel. For brothels, curiously enough, also influenced how cities built their districts, how railways chose their stops, and even how tourism quietly reshaped neighborhoods in ways still visible today. The echoes of doctors' footsteps fade, their black bags closed, their instruments tucked away, and we step once more into the broader city. Outside, London's streets stretched like veins of stone and soot, carrying people in carriages and on foot, carrying voices, carrying change. And here, too, the story of brothels quietly touches something larger: travel, movement, and the shaping of districts themselves. Imagine London in the 1870s. The railways are expanding, the city swelling outward with every new line. A traveller steps off at a busy station, King's Cross, Paddington, Victoria, and what greets him nearby? Hotels, taverns, lodging houses, and tucked among them, brothels. Their presence was not accidental. They followed the flow of movement, setting themselves where men arrived weary from journeys, seeking comfort, seeking company, seeking what the quiet countryside could not give. Brothels, in this way, shaped neighbourhoods. Certain districts became known for them: the maze of alleys in Soho, the dim lanes near Covent Garden, the dockside quarters where sailors spilled ashore. These areas gained reputations that lasted generations, reputations still whispered in place names today. Travel shaped brothels, and brothels in turn shaped travel. Consider tourism. Respectable guides often skipped mention of such places, yet foreign visitors found them quickly, drawn as much by curiosity as by desire. Diaries and letters of the time record how travellers sought out the hidden life of London, how guides, unofficial ones, led them through narrow streets to houses behind discreet doors. In this way, brothels became part of the city's unspoken map, a form of tourism outside the pages of Baedeker and Murray. Picture the sounds, the hiss of steam as a train brakes in a station, the shuffle of boots on cobblestones, the muffled laughter spilling from a curtained window nearby. To a traveller, this was the pulse of London, raw and immediate, not polished like the halls of Westminster, but alive in its own rough glamour. And isn't it remarkable? These hidden houses even influenced urban planning. As districts gained reputations, property values shifted, laws were tested, police patrols thickened. Whole neighbourhoods were marked by their presence, shaping where hotels were built, where theatres rose, where respectable families hesitated to move. The city itself, in bricks and maps, bore their imprint. Even the railway timetables played a role. Brothels adjusted to the rhythm of arrivals and departures, opening late, staying lit until the early hours. Later, when modern nightlife grew, clubs, restaurants, cabarets, it mirrored this rhythm, tied not to the sun but to the clock of travel. Once again, what seemed scandalous at first became ordinary in time. Let us imagine a visitor stepping into such a house after a long journey. His boots are dusty, his coat carries the scent of coal smoke from the train. A maid greets him softly, offers wine, draws him into a room warmed with lamplight. Outside, the city roars, inside, quiet and comfort. For the traveller, this is more than indulgence. It is hospitality, a pause, a shelter. And in that pause lies the seed of what would later become the hotel industry's hallmark, the promise of warmth, food, and rest at the edge of every journey. So when we think of London's districts today, Soho with its theatres, Covent Garden with its bustle, King's Cross with its mix of travellers, we are also walking through these shadows of that earlier life, those houses that dared to open where movement was greatest. Twice again, brothels had led, first in shaping neighbourhoods, then in shaping the very rhythm of nightlife and hospitality around travel. Isn't it curious how history hides such things? Respectable society pretended not to notice, yet the imprint remains, in street names, in the clustering of theatres, in the very way a city organises itself around the traveller's need for rest. And now, as the last train whistles in the distance, steam fading into the night, let us leave the station and its shadowed streets. Ahead lies another chapter, this time not of travel, but of writing. For brothels were not only visited, they were recorded, described, imagined in literature, shaping novels and poems long before the public admitted how fascinated it was. The whistle of the last train fades, steam dissolves into the fog, and we follow the soft turn of pages. For if brothels shaped streets and neighbourhoods, they also seeped into literature. They became the whispered subject of novels, the hinted backdrop of plays, the ghostly presence in poems. Sometimes named directly, sometimes only suggested, but always there, an undercurrent of fascination in Victorian writing. Imagine a writer in the 1860s seated at a desk by candlelight. The streets outside are quiet, but his mind wanders to places he cannot mention openly. He dips his pen in ink, and with careful strokes he weaves them in, not with blunt honesty, but with shadows. Characters who vanish down narrow alleys, women described as fallen angels, neighbourhoods drawn with just enough detail for readers to recognise without admitting they understood. Literature became a mirror, reflecting the brothel not as fact but as suggestion. Think of Charles Dickens. Though he never wrote directly of brothels, his novels wander close. Streets thick with mystery, women hovering on the margins, parlours filled with laughter and despair. Readers at the time knew what was being hinted at. Similarly, poets like Swinburne laced their verses with sensuality, so daring that critics called them corrupting. Even more curious were the private pamphlets and underground novels, sold discreetly, hidden beneath counters, passed from hand to hand. In them, brothels were described not in whispers but in vivid detail. Picture the scene. A small group of men in a coffee house, one sliding a thin booklet across the table with a smile, the other tucking it quickly into his coat. At home, the booklet is read by candlelight, the prose clumsy but daring, describing rooms lit by gaslight, women draped in crimson, the scents of wine and perfume mingling in the air. It was not art by polite standards, but it was literature all the same, literature shaped by the very houses society pretended to shun. And isn't it remarkable? On one level, society condemned such writing. On another, it consumed it eagerly. The fascination with brothels became part of the Victorian imagination, feeding both moral outrage and private curiosity. Even in respectable novels, shadows of that fascination linger. Characters marked as fallen, places described as disreputable, always hinting at what readers already knew. By the 1880s, journalists joined the act. Investigative pieces claimed to expose the underworld of London, describing brothels in dramatic tones. Some exaggerated wildly, but others gave glimpses of truth. How the rooms were furnished, how clients behaved, how rules were enforced. Readers devoured these articles, half in horror, half in secret excitement. In this way, brothels became both lived spaces and imagined ones, shaping public consciousness as much as private experience. Picture the textures of it, the faint crackle of a newspaper being folded, the whisper of a novel's page turned, the flicker of candlelight across words that dared more than they admitted. Literature carried the brothel into drawing rooms and libraries, cloaked in metaphor but alive in imagination. Isn't it curious? Twice again the brothel was ahead, first in shaping the hidden culture of underground writing, then in pushing the boundaries of mainstream literature itself. In their shadow, Victorian readers learned to read between the lines, to recognize hints, to savor suggestion. The art of subtlety in prose, the delicacy of implication, all were sharpened in part by the taboo subject that could not be named outright. So let us close that book gently now, the page soft beneath our fingers, the candle burning low beside us. Ahead lies another chapter, not of words on paper, but of whispers in the air, for brothels also shaped language itself, giving rise to slang, euphemisms, and turns of phrase that crept quietly into everyday speech, where many remain even now. The candle beside us burns lower, its flame trembling, and with the last turn of a page we leave literature behind. Now we listen instead. Not to music, not to laughter, but to language itself. For Victorian brothels, as strange as it may seem, shaped the very words people used. They created slang, birthed euphemisms, and seeded phrases that slipped quietly into everyday English, where many still live today. Imagine London in 1875. The streets are alive with voices. Hawkers selling wares, cabmen shouting for fares, children calling to each other across alleys. And beneath this chorus lies another language, the slang of the underworld, much of it born in taverns and brothels. Ordinary people, without realizing it, borrowed those words, carrying them outward like seeds scattered on the wind. Take, for example, the phrase red light district. Today it seems obvious, but in the 19th century, brothels sometimes used lamps or red curtains in their windows to signal business discreetly. The phrase travelled across oceans, spreading from London to New York, from Paris to Melbourne, until it became the common way of naming entire neighbourhoods. A whisper of one lamp in one window, repeated until it marked maps and histories. Other phrases slipped in more quietly. To paint the town red, originally a phrase tied to wild nights of drinking and pleasure, often included visits to brothels as part of its meaning. Soiled dove became a euphemism for a prostitute, softened, almost poetic. Sporting life once meant not athletics, but the blend of gambling, taverns and brothels. In time its meaning shifted, but its roots remained in those hidden rooms. Picture the sound of it. A man boasting to friends in a tavern, his words colourful, his slang borrowed from a house he would never name. The laughter spreads, the phrase sticks, and soon even those who never set foot in such places repeat the words without knowing their origin. Language moves that way, quietly, invisibly, reshaping itself in shadows. And isn't it fascinating? Proper Victorian society prided itself on purity of speech, yet its vocabulary was often borrowed from the very places it condemned. Euphemisms became a kind of code, houses of ill repute, fallen women, the night trade. Everyone understood, though no one spoke directly. In this way, brothels taught society the art of speaking without saying, of circling truth with softer words. That art remains with us still. Even professional writers borrowed this language. Journalists filled their reports with phrases like dens of vice or notorious houses, phrases heavy with judgment yet shaped by brothel slang. Novelists slipped in coded references, confident their readers would catch the hint. Slowly, English itself absorbed the influence, until what was once taboo became part of ordinary speech. Picture a dictionary on a scholar's desk, its pages crisp and serious. Now imagine the words inside it. Red light, sporting, fallen. Words whose roots trace back to lamplit rooms, velvet curtains, and whispered bargains. The seriousness of scholarship is built, oddly enough, on the playful inventiveness of slang born in shadow. Isn't it strange? Once again, brothels led twice, first in coining words and phrases, then in forcing society to adopt euphemisms, teaching it the delicate balance of saying much while appearing to say little. Out of laughter and secrecy grew the very fabric of polite language. So let us step away from those whispers now, the echoes of slang fading into the city's chorus. Ahead lies another chapter, not of words but of pictures, photography once more, for brothels played a surprising role in the early spread of erotic photography, shaping both technology and taste long before such images became art. The echoes of slang and euphemism fade into the night air, leaving behind a city where words themselves carried secrets. Now, let us turn not to language, but to images. Frozen moments on paper, shadows caught by new technology. For brothels, in their quiet daring, played a hidden role in the early spread of photography, especially the kind of images society called indecent, yet later came to name as art. Imagine London in the 1850s. Photography was still young, a marvel of chemistry and patience. Families sat stiffly for portraits. Men posed with serious faces, women with folded hands. Exposure times were long, smiles blurred. But behind closed doors, other uses for the camera began. In brothels, photographs became souvenirs, advertisements, curiosities, sometimes staged, sometimes natural. They captured not ancestors or landscapes, but figures draped in silk, reclining on chaise lounges, eyes meeting the lens directly. Picture the scene. A room lit by gas lamps carefully adjusted, curtains drawn, a backdrop of velvet or painted scenery hung behind. A photographer adjusts his camera, the great wooden box with its brass lens gleaming. A woman poses, hair loose, gown slipping just enough to suggest more than it shows. The shutter clicks softly, and a moment of intimacy is fixed on glass. In that click lies both scandal and innovation. These images, known as carte de visite or cabinet cards, circulated quietly. Some were sold discreetly to clients, others kept by the house to entice new visitors. Later they spread further, across cities, across countries, often hidden in drawers or slipped between the pages of books. They blurred the line between memory and fantasy, between record and art. And isn't it striking? Society outside condemned them as immoral, yet at the same time, it was fascinated. Collectors emerged, swapping images like stamps. Some photographers grew wealthy, and slowly the artistry improved. Lighting was studied, poses refined, compositions made more elegant. What began in scandal evolved into early forms of glamour photography, even portraiture. Picture the textures, the glossy card cool between fingers, the faint smell of chemical fixers still lingering, the grain of velvet in the backdrop visible in the print. To hold such an image was to hold a secret, a fragment of a world both forbidden and irresistibly modern. Later, when photography matured, society would embrace similar aesthetics openly. Fashion photography, artistic nudes, even cinema. But the seed had been planted earlier, in places society refused to name. Brothels had led twice again, first in daring to use photography for intimacy, then in shaping the visual language of allure that would one day fill magazines and galleries. Isn't it curious how the same society that shunned these images later celebrated them, reframing them as art, forgetting, or perhaps pretending to forget, where the style had been born? So let us place that photograph gently back into its velvet-lined box, the shutters echo still humming softly in memory. Ahead lies another chapter, not of pictures but of music once more. This time the broader influence, how the rhythms and songs of brothels crossed into music halls and even opera, reshaping the entertainment of an entire age. The faint click of a camera shutter lingers in the air, but now another sound rises, soft music drifting through lamplight, carrying laughter, rhythm, and mood. For brothels were not only galleries of early photography, they were also small concert halls, places where music was played, tested, and shaped before it echoed into the larger world. Imagine a parlour in Soho in the late 1860s. The gas lamps hum, velvet curtains draw the night away, and in the corner stands a piano. Its polished keys gleam as a young woman plays, not with rigid precision but with playful ease. The tune is light, perhaps borrowed from a street song, perhaps invented on the spot. Clients hum along, feet tap, a laugh escapes here and there. This is music as comfort, not performance, music alive in its closeness. But the story goes deeper. Many of the songs tested in these parlours later appeared in music halls, where they grew into crowd favourites. Brothels were places of experimentation, where lyrics could be daring, rhythms freer. A cheeky rhyme whispered here might, within months, become a chorus sung by hundreds in a hall. The boundary between private and public blurred, the brothel acting as a rehearsal stage for the culture outside. Picture the sound, the thrum of a banjo plucked gently, the wheeze of an accordion filling the air, voices rising in untrained harmony. These instruments, still seen as foreign or low class, found acceptance here first. Later they would be celebrated in folk revivals, even woven into operas and symphonies. But their first London homes were often behind discreet doors. And isn't it fascinating? Respectable Victorian households prize solemnity in music. Hymns, waltzes, carefully rehearsed minuets. But in brothels, variety reigned. A French chanson might follow a sea shanty. A bawdy tune might slip into a romantic ballad. Clients carried those melodies outward, humming them in taverns, requesting them from musicians, until they seeped into the broader soundscape of the city. Some brothels even hosted small ensembles, trios of violin, flute and piano, filling rooms with a richness unusual for private houses. Others employed singers who improvised verses about the guests themselves, sparking laughter and a sense of intimacy. It was theatre in miniature, but more daring, more relaxed. Later, when London's cabaret culture blossomed, its roots could be traced back here. Picture it clearly. The low hum of a violin bow drawn across strings, the steady rhythm of piano keys, the warmth of voices joining in chorus. Outside, the city's fog presses against the windows, but inside, sound makes the air feel alive, shimmering with energy. And isn't it curious? Twice again, brothels led the way, first in giving music freedom to play, to joke, to experiment, then in letting those experiments ripple outward, shaping the songs of music halls, the humour of cabarets, even the daring of opera when composers finally borrowed what had once been called vulgar. So let us let the last note fade into silence, the echo of strings soft against velvet curtains. Ahead lies another chapter, not of sound but of scent, for even the perfumes, oils and subtle fragrances of brothels taught Victorians new ways to think about the air they breathed, the skin they touched, and the moods created by smell itself. The last violin note fades into velvet air, and now our senses shift. No longer sound, but scent. For in Victorian brothels, fragrance was not only ornament, it was atmosphere, a quiet innovation in how people thought about rooms, moods, even the body itself. Imagine entering such a house in 1872. The streets outside smell of soot and horse dung, the river carries a sour tang, and even respectable parlours often reek faintly of coal smoke. But within these discreet doors, the air feels transformed. Rosewater drifts faintly through the hall. A hint of lavender rises from folded linens. Somewhere, incense burns low, mixing with the sweetness of wine. For the visitor, it is not only sight or sound that seduces, it is the air itself, carefully crafted to soothe. Perfume had existed for centuries, of course, but in the Victorian age it was controversial. Many considered it vulgar, even sinful, too sensual for respectable women. Brothels, however, embraced it. Workers wore oils of jasmine, sandalwood and patchouli. Rooms were dabbed with bergamot or lemon. Carpets were sprinkled with powdered lavender to mask dampness. Even bowls of herbs and petals were set out, absorbing smoke and releasing fragrance when stirred. Picture the textures of it. A bottle of cut glass, its stopper lifted to reveal sharp citrus. A sachet of crushed roses tucked into a drawer. A small censer releasing curls of sweet smoke into the air. The senses entwined. Sight, sound, touch, but always with scent lingering, weaving it all together. And isn't it fascinating? Later, perfumed soaps and scented candles would become the pride of middle-class homes. Shops like Penhaligon's and florists built fortunes selling fragrances once dismissed as improper. But brothels had already been experimenting, first in making scent central to atmosphere, then in teaching society that fragrance could be both pleasure and refinement. Even the idea of personal scent, perfume not just as cover but as signature, was shaped here. A guest might remember a woman not only by her laugh or her gown, but by the trace of jasmine she left in the room. Later this idea became fashionable, that perfume was identity, that each person carried a fragrance uniquely their own. Picture it again, the hush of a parlour, lamplight glowing, silk rustling, and in the air, a blend of rose and smoke, lavender and wine. To breathe was to participate in an atmosphere crafted with care. one that lingered long after the visit ended. Isn't it strange how fragrance, once condemned as indecent, became a hallmark of luxury, of elegance, of home comfort? Once again, brothels had led twice, first in daring to use scent freely, then in teaching society how to weave it into daily life. So let us breathe out gently now, letting that perfume drift away like mist into night. Ahead lies another chapter, not of scent but of time itself, for brothels also shaped the rhythms of night and day, opening the city to new hours of life, hours that still shape how we live today. The perfume drifts away like mist, leaving the room still and warm. And now, let us listen to something more invisible, time itself. For Victorian brothels, as curious as it may seem, played with the hours of night and day, shaping how the city learned to live after dark. Imagine London in 1865. Respectable families kept strict hours, supper at 7, bed by 10, shutters drawn against the fog. Streets emptied, save for the occasional watchman or carriage. But in the hidden quarters, brothels stirred awake just as others slept. Lamps were lit, fires stoked, music began to play. The city gained a second life, one measured not by sunlight, but by desire and indulgence. Brothels opened late and closed later still. They adjusted themselves to the railway timetables, to the end of theatre performances, to the pauses after political meetings or dinners. Where most households surrendered to silence, these houses embraced the hours between midnight and dawn. Clients knew they could always find a door open, a lamp glowing, a room waiting. Picture the sounds, the muffled creak of a carriage arriving at 2 a.m, the quick shuffle of boots on cobblestones, the faint laughter spilling from behind curtains while the rest of the city slept. Within those walls, time stretched differently. An hour felt softer, a night passed more swiftly, morning often came unannounced. And isn't it fascinating? The very idea of nightlife, restaurants open late, music halls running into midnight, clubs serving guests into the early hours, was shaped by this rhythm. At first, only brothels dared. Later, hotels began to imitate them, offering late suppers and all-night service. Theatres extended their shows, taverns stayed open longer. Soon the city learned to live by 2 clocks, one for daylight, one for night. Even the concept of the night worker grew here. Musicians, cooks, laundresses, even carriage drivers built livelihoods around these houses. Entire microeconomies emerged, fueled by the rhythm of midnight hours. Later, society would call it the service industry. At first, it was simply survival, shaped by the demands of brothel life. Picture the textures, a lamp burning steadily at 3 a.m, its glass warm to the touch, sheets changed in the hush before dawn, a maid yawning softly as she carries away an empty tray. Time itself felt different, less rigid, more fluid, measured not by clocks but by moments. And isn't it strange? Today, cities boast of being 24-hour of never sleeping, yet the seed of that idea was planted here, in places once condemned, where night was embraced rather than feared. Twice again, brothels led, first in bending time toward the night, then in teaching society how to weave those hours into everyday life. So let us step gently out of that endless night, the glow of lamps fading as dawn touches the sky. Ahead lies our final chapter, not of time but of memory itself, for in the end brothels left behind not only scandal, but innovations that changed how Victorians lived, innovations that still linger quietly in the way we eat, dress, travel, and dream. The lamps of midnight fade, the dawn creeps gently across the rooftops, and we step into the quietest chamber of all, memory. For brothels, however scandalous they seemed in their own time, left behind traces far subtler than scandal. They left habits, ideas, innovations that shaped the rhythm of everyday life long after their doors were closed. Imagine a Victorian gentleman decades later sitting in his parlour in the 1890s. He sips tea from fine china, reads a newspaper printed with advertisements for perfumes, hotels, and evening entertainments. He does not think of brothels, and yet the perfume he wears, the hotel he once visited, the dinner he ate at midnight, the slang he chuckles at, all carry the fingerprints of those hidden houses, They have melted into normal life, their origins blurred, their influence invisible. Consider the small things, the idea of fresh linens for every guest, now taken for granted, the habit of offering warm baths on arrival, the custom of discreet bookkeeping, of private staircases, of all-night service. Each was once unusual, even daring. Each was practiced first in places polite society scorned. But time, like a tide, washed away their secrecy, leaving only the practices behind. Picture the textures. A clean towel folded neatly in a modern hotel room, the faint glow of a bedside lamp turned low, a midnight supper delivered quietly to a guest. These comforts feel ordinary now, but they were once innovations, rehearsed long ago in quiet parlours behind velvet curtains. And isn't it remarkable? Twice again, brothels shaped the future, first by necessity, then by imitation. Society, eager to forget their existence, borrowed from them nonetheless. In silence, their influence travelled farther than any scandal. The memory of music too lingers. Songs once whispered in parlours found their way into music halls, into sheet music bought by respectable families. Phrases once coded in slang became ordinary language. Scents once condemned as indecent became luxuries, and the night once feared became a time of life, embraced by cities as proudly as the day. Isn't it strange how the world borrows from the very things it claims to reject? This is history's quiet joke played softly like a lullaby. So let us close this chapter gently, with the hush of memory, the soft hum of practices that outlived their scandal. But the story does not end here. For though 24 chapters have carried us far, there are more paths still, 6 more to be exact. Ahead lie fresh turns, how architecture continued to borrow, how medicine shifted once more, how art, travel, and even technology carried forward these lessons. And in those last 6 chapters we will see again the quiet truth, that the strangest places sometimes shape the most ordinary parts of life. The hush of memory still lingers, like the faint trace of lavender on a pillow, but time moves us gently onward. Beyond the 24th door lies another chamber of history, one that glimmers with faint smoke and rising heat. For in Victorian brothels, the hearth was not merely a source of warmth, it became a stage for innovation, a place where comfort, secrecy, and subtlety intertwined in ways that changed how Victorians thought about the simple act of keeping warm. Imagine entering such a house in the deep winter of 1874. Outside, the streets are frozen, fog clinging low, horse hooves striking hard against icy cobblestones. Most London homes shiver with draughts, coal fires burning weakly, servants struggling to keep heat from escaping through thin windows. Yet step into the parlour of a brothel, and the difference is immediate. The room glows with warmth. The air is soft, carrying not the harsh tang of smoke but the subtle sweetness of scented coals. Curtains are drawn thick, carpets laid deep, fireplaces tended with almost ritual care. It was not indulgence alone that drove this care. Warmth here meant health, comfort, even privacy. Fires were stoked to keep not only bodies warm, but spirits soothed. Drafts were sealed, hearths designed to burn cleaner, chimneys adjusted to carry smoke away without betraying the building's purpose to watchful neighbours. In a sense, brothels became quiet laboratories for domestic heating, their need for comfort and discretion pushing them to experiment where ordinary households may do. Picture the textures of it. The crackle of coal, the faint hiss as damp wood meets flame, the glow of embers painting walls in amber light. A guest sinks into a chair, boots stretching toward the hearth, the fatigue of cold travel melting into warmth. A glass of port appears, the scent of cinnamon drifting faintly from a simmering pot on the grate. It is hospitality by firelight, a ritual far ahead of what most Londoners experienced at home, and isn't it remarkable? At a time when many houses still relied on smoky stoves and draughty rooms, brothels invested in cleaner burning coals, in iron grates that radiated more evenly, even in early experiments with piped hot water to supplement heat. Later, as the middle classes embraced new heating technologies, many of these innovations were marketed as novelties, but here necessity had already refined them. Twice again the brothel led, first in experimenting with warmth as atmosphere, then in normalizing the idea of firelight as a setting for intimacy and comfort. Even the ritual of tending the fire was shaped here. Maids and attendants learned to keep flames constant, to time the renewal of coals with the flow of the evening. A fire that faltered was more than inconvenience. It disrupted mood, broke the spell of hospitality. In this way, tending the hearth became an art, one that hotels and restaurants would later imitate when they began advertising always warm parlours as a mark of refinement. Picture the wider scene. The streets outside, grey and raw, the poor shivering in damp rooms, the respectable middle classes wrapped in shawls by weak stoves. And yet, within these hidden houses, warmth reigned like a quiet luxury, proof that comfort could be crafted deliberately, not left to chance. This too shaped memory. Clients who had known only the chill of ordinary homes discovered what true warmth felt like, and they carried that expectation outward. And isn't it curious? Today, when we light a fire for atmosphere rather than necessity, when hotels advertise glowing hearths, when we speak of cozy evenings as though warmth itself is a mood, we echo the same ideas rehearsed here first. Out of secrecy came a culture of comfort, one that melted into the mainstream like snow against hot coal. So let us sit by that fire a little longer, the embers glowing, the crackle steady, the warmth wrapping us like a heavy blanket. Outside, the night deepens, but within, the air feels timeless, carrying both survival and luxury in its flame. And when at last we rise, brushing ash from our thoughts, we will step into another chapter, not of warmth, but of coldness resisted, for brothels also shaped the rituals of bathing and cleanliness long before society made them daily practice. The crackle of fire still warms our ears, the glow of embers still rests against our eyes. But now another comfort rises, not the hearth, but the bath. For if warmth was one half of comfort, cleanliness was the other. And in Victorian brothels, bathing became not just a necessity, but a ritual, a quiet art that would later spill into ordinary life. Imagine London in the 1870s. Outside these houses, most homes had no private baths. Families used tin tubs dragged into kitchens, filled with kettles of hot water shared among many. Public bathhouses existed, but they were crowded, often unsanitary, smelling of damp wood and harsh soap. The idea of daily bathing was rare, even eccentric. Yet step into a brothel and the difference was startling. Here, bathing was expected. Here it was part of the experience. Picture the scene. A guest arrives from a long journey, his boots caked in dust, his coat heavy with soot from trains and carriages. Before any entertainment begins, a maid offers him a bath. The room is prepared. Candles glowing, steam rising, towels folded neatly. Water is poured, warmed carefully over coals scented with herbs or oils. The air carries lavender, rosemary, sometimes even lemon. To wash was to cleanse the body, yes, but also to refresh the mind, to soften the mood, to prepare the spirit for pleasure. For the workers too, bathing was central. Cleanliness was both protection and presentation. Basins stood ready, towels aired, soaps imported from France or Italy. Some houses even experimented with early forms of piped water, drawing from cisterns to avoid the endless carrying of buckets. Where ordinary London homes tolerated grime, these houses pursued a kind of purity, not out of morality, but practicality, necessity, and pride. And isn't it remarkable? Society at large considered such indulgence extravagant, even immoral. Yet within a few decades, the very practice of regular bathing became a mark of respectability. Soap companies boomed, perfumed waters became fashionable. By the turn of the century, even the middle classes spoke of cleanliness as next to godliness. But long before the sermon, the ritual was rehearsed in secret rooms, lit by candles and scented steam. Picture the textures, the soft splash of water against porcelain, the hiss of steam curling upward, the feel of a towel warmed by the hearth. A guest sinks into the tub, eyes closing, muscles easing. Outside, the city coughs in smoke and soot, but here, the air feels clear, the body light, the mind soothed. It is more than washing, it is renewal. And isn't it curious? Twice again, brothels led the way, first in normalizing the bath as part of hospitality, then in teaching society that bathing could be more than duty. It could be pleasure, ritual, luxury. Today, when we light candles beside a tub, when we speak of spa experiences, when hotels offer scented soaps and plush towels, we echo a lineage that began in those discreet parlours. Even medicine intersected here. Doctors who condemned brothels nonetheless noted the benefits of frequent bathing, how it reduced infection, soothed nerves, refreshed the constitution. Reformers who spoke against immorality quietly encouraged public baths, unknowingly borrowing from the very houses they shunned. In this way, the practice spread outward, disguised as hygiene, rooted in necessity, flowering into culture. So let us linger in that scented steam a moment longer, the candles flickering, the water warm, the mind drifting. Then, as we rise, toweling gently, stepping into fresh linen, we move toward another chamber, not of bathing, but of dressing. For brothels, too, shaped fashion, teaching society not only what to wear, but how clothing itself could speak in whispers louder than words. The last curl of steam fades, the water cools, and linen wraps softly around the skin. Clean and refreshed, we now turn to what comes next, dressing. For in Victorian brothels, clothing was never just fabric. It was theatre, language, seduction, and innovation. What was worn in those rooms, whispered behind velvet curtains, would ripple outward into fashion itself. Imagine London in the late 1870s. Outside, the streets are grey, lined with stiff collars, heavy coats, and skirts weighed down by mud. Respectable women dressed with restraint, every button fastened, every ribbon modest. Yet within brothels, the rules bent. Clothes were chosen not for duty, but for effect. Fabrics gleamed with satin, corsets shaped figures more daringly, colours glowed brighter than the streets allowed. Clothing here spoke of fantasy, of performance, of a life unbound by ordinary rules. Picture the scene. A woman steps softly into the parlour, her gown of crimson silk whispering as she moves. The gaslight catches the sheen of satin ribbons, the sparkle of jet beads. A guest, weary from the soot-stained city, feels as though he has entered another world. Not London's grey fog, but a stage where colour, texture and shape perform a play. Even the act of removing a glove, of loosening a ribbon, becomes a kind of script, a choreography of fabric and flesh. And isn't it fascinating? Many of the fashions later celebrated in theatres, and even in high society, were rehearsed first in brothels. The daring cut of a bodice, the use of bright colours, the emphasis on accessories, these were tested here, adjusted, perfected. Clients carried the memory outward, praising a gown's cut or a ribbon's hue, until tailors and dressmakers noticed. Slowly, what was once scandalous became stylish. Even men's fashion shifted here. Brothels embraced smoking jackets, softer fabrics, brighter waistcoats. A man relaxing in velvet indoors might later request the same comfort in his home attire. Soon, the smoking jacket became a respectable staple. Again, the pattern is clear. Innovation rehearsed in secrecy, absorbed later by society. Picture the textures, the smooth glide of silk across skin, the stiff pull of a corset's laces, the soft rustle of lace cuffs against wood. Each sound and touch added to atmosphere, making fashion not merely about appearance, but about sensation. Later, the idea of clothing as self-expression, beyond duty, beyond modesty, would become central to modern fashion. But in the 19th century, it was born here, in these discrete performances of fabric. Isn't it curious how even perfume and clothing work together here? A ribbon scented faintly with jasmine, a gown brushed with rosewater, a glove carrying the faint warmth of skin. Layers of identity were woven into garments, teaching society to think of dress not just as cover, but as presence or a theatre. And isn't it stranger still how society later forgot these origins? Museums of fashion now display gowns and jackets as art, yet the earliest rehearsals of these choices were in houses most historians would rather not name. Twice again brothels led, first in daring to bend fashion toward allure, then in teaching society that clothes could speak moods as clearly as words. So let us loosen that crimson ribbon gently, fold the satin gown softly aside, and step into the next chamber, not of dressing, but of eating. For brothels also shaped how food was served, what hours it was offered, and how meals themselves became part of the theatre of night. The silk gown is folded away, the crimson ribbon rests like a whisper on the chair, and now another scent rises, not of perfume, not of lavender baths, but of food. For in Victorian brothels, dining was not simply a matter of filling the stomach. It was a theatre of taste, timing, and atmosphere. Meals were part of the performance, part of the comfort, part of the memory guests carried back into the grey streets of London. Imagine entering such a house near midnight in 1880. The city outside has long gone quiet. Shops shuttered, taverns closing, respectable households asleep. But within these hidden rooms, trays appear as though summoned by thought itself. A roast chicken carved neatly, its juices glistening in candlelight. Small pastries dusted with sugar. Fruits sliced and arranged on silver platters. Even oysters, fresh from the market, cooled on crushed ice. This was not the hasty supper of ordinary homes. This was indulgence prepared for odd hours, when most of the city offered nothing at all. Picture the textures, the faint clink of silver against china, the soft pop of a cork, the scent of spiced wine warming by the fire. Guests reclined, eating not hurriedly but slowly, each bite another layer of atmosphere. To eat here was to step out of time, to taste comfort at an hour when the rest of London slept. And isn't it remarkable? Hotels and restaurants at the time rarely offered late meals. Kitchens closed early, and travellers often went hungry if they arrived past supper. But in brothels, food was essential. Hunger disrupted mood, dulled pleasure, weakened the illusion of comfort, and so brothels became some of the first establishments to normalise late-night dining, an idea that hotels and clubs would later adopt proudly as innovation. Even the menus themselves carried influence. French dishes appeared here before they reached respectable dining tables. Ragouts rich with herbs, pastries filled with cream, wines paired thoughtfully with meats. Brothels experimented with variety, with luxury, with pairing taste to experience. Later, society's fascination with continental cuisine would echo these private rehearsals. Isn't it curious how dining also became ritual here? A guest might share oysters before the evening's amusements, sip champagne afterward, nibble sugared almonds as the lamps burned low. The rhythm of food intertwined with the rhythm of the night. Pleasure was not confined to one sense. It unfolded across taste, smell, sight, and sound. Picture it more clearly. A silver tray set upon velvet, the soft glow of candles reflecting in glass, the sweetness of wine warming the tongue. A laugh rises, soft music hums in the corner, a plate is offered again. Outside, fog drapes the city in silence. Inside, the room glows with flavour and warmth, a private feast at an impossible hour. And isn't it strange? Today, when we think of room service, of late-night restaurants, of cities alive with food until dawn, we are seeing the shadows of what brothels rehearsed long ago. Twice again, they led. First in feeding bodies at hours others neglected, then in shaping dining into an experience of pleasure itself, not just necessity. Even reformers noted it, though indirectly. Articles of the 1880s spoke of the decadent feasts of disreputable houses, condemning them as wasteful, excessive. Yet within a generation, the same dishes, the same timing, the same indulgences appeared proudly in clubs and hotels. The line between scandal and culture blurred once more. So let us leave that silver tray now, the last almond melting on the tongue, the corked bottle resting empty by the fire. Ahead lies another chapter, not of food but of art. For brothels, too, shape the paintings, sketches and decorations of the age, filling walls with images that hovered between scandal and beauty, and teaching society how to see the human form anew. The silver tray has been cleared, the last almond a memory on the tongue, and now our gaze turns to the walls. For in Victorian brothels, art was not a luxury reserved for galleries or aristocratic mansions. It was atmosphere, performance, even instruction. Paintings, sketches and decorations filled these rooms, shaping not only mood but also society's way of seeing the human form. Imagine stepping into a parlour in 1876. The fire glows softly, and above the mantelpiece hangs a painting, not of landscapes or portraits, but of figures, sometimes clothed in flowing silks, sometimes less so, sometimes in scenes so daring that polite society would have gasped. These images were not displayed in drawing rooms or tea parlours. They belonged here, in a space where fantasy and intimacy overlapped. And yet, from here, their influence seeped outward, quiet but steady. Picture the textures: gilt frames catching the candlelight, soft sketches tucked into corners, lithographs pinned discreetly behind curtains. Even furniture carried decoration, carved figures in wood, inlaid patterns suggesting movement, velvet, embroidered with designs hinting at vines, blossoms, and sometimes bodies. To sit in such a room was to be surrounded by art, subtle or overt, whispering a different vision of beauty. And isn't it fascinating? Many artists who later gained respect began by selling sketches to these houses. Their work could not yet hang in salons or galleries, but here it found eager audiences. Brothels became patrons, supporting painters, sculptors, even photographers when the wider world turned away. Some of the daring art styles later embraced by modernism, looser lines, sensual forms, bold colours, were tested here first, in hidden galleries of desire. Even respectable art critics noticed, though obliquely. They spoke of decadent tendencies, of foreign influences creeping into English painting. What they did not say openly was that much of this influence came from places they refused to acknowledge. Again, society borrowed without admitting, carrying the daring of brothel walls into the public halls of art. Picture a guest reclining on a chaise lounge, sipping wine, his eyes drawn not only to the woman beside him, but also to the painting above her. A reclining Venus, perhaps, or a mythological scene with more skin than drapery. The image lingered as strongly as the moment itself. Later, when he visited a gallery, he might see echoes of that same pose, that same curve of body, dressed now in myth but alive with the same spirit. Isn't it strange how art once condemned as obscene later became heritage, displayed proudly in museums? The line between scandal and masterpiece blurred, painted over by time. Twice again brothels led, first in daring to display and support sensual art, then in shaping how society learned to appreciate the human form as beauty rather than shame. Even decoration itself, the use of mirrors, patterned wallpaper, bold colours spread outward. Victorian homes grew bolder with reds and golds, with ornate frames and heavy fabrics. Much of what we think of as Victorian interior style was rehearsed here, where atmosphere mattered most. So let us leave that parlour of painted walls now, the gilt frames gleaming softly in memory. Ahead lies our final chapter, the 30th, where all these strands, warmth, bathing, dress, food, music, art come together. For in the end, Victorian brothels were more than scandal. They were laboratories of modern life, shaping comforts and habits that still guide us, quietly, even as we drift into dreams. The painted walls fade behind us, the gilt frames glimmer one last time, and we step into the quietest chamber of all, the one where everything meets. Warmth from the fire, steam from the bath, silks folded neatly, trays of food half forgotten, music soft, perfume lingering, pictures watching from the walls. All these threads gather here, woven into a tapestry of memory. For in Victorian brothels, beneath the scandal, lay something larger, an unspoken rehearsal for modern life. Imagine walking through one of these houses slowly, as though drifting through a dream. The parlour glows with lamplight, carpets thick beneath your feet. From the hearth comes steady warmth, from the air the whisper of lavender and rosewater. A piano hums faintly, a laugh ripples, a silver tray waits with sugared almonds. On the wall a painting watches. Behind a door, a bath steams gently, fresh linen folded nearby. And everywhere, silence hums with comfort, crafted carefully, deliberately, as though the world outside with its smoke and rules had been replaced entirely. Picture the textures, silk brushing softly against wood, warm towels wrapped around the body, the smooth chill of porcelain cups, the faint crackle of coal. Each sense attended, each detail shaped. For the guest, it was indulgence. For the house, it was survival. But for history, it was innovation. Rituals rehearsed here, repeated later in hotels, in restaurants, in theatres, in homes. And isn't it remarkable? Brothels, condemned as shameful, became laboratories of modernity. Twice again, always twice. First in daring what society denied, then in passing those practices quietly into the world outside. The warm bath, the scented room, the late-night meal, the softened lighting, the discreet ledger, the private staircase. Each one now ordinary, but once extraordinary, once scandalous, once hidden behind velvet curtains. Isn't it curious how the very comforts we call respectable today were once called indecent? A hotel boasting of late suppers echoes the trays of oysters once served at midnight. A department store perfuming its counters echoes the oils once dabbed on ribbons. A gallery displaying nudes under bright light echoes the paintings once hung discreetly in parlours. Even the very idea of nightlife, streets alive after dark, cities that do not sleep, began in those hidden hours. Now imagine Victorian reformers writing articles in trembling outrage, warning of excess and danger. They could not see what was happening beneath their own words. They sought to erase brothels, to shut doors, to silence music. And in one sense, they succeeded. Laws passed, houses closed, reputations ruined. But in another sense, they failed. For the habits, the ideas, the comforts had already escaped, carried invisibly into daily life. Like perfume drifting into fabric, the influence lingered, impossible to wash out. Picture it one last time, a room lit with fire and lamp, a guest reclining, the night alive with sound and scent. Outside, the fog presses heavy. Inside, the future is rehearsed. The city we know today, its hotels, its restaurants, its music halls, its perfumes, its fashion, its very language, carries echoes of this hidden stage. The brothel becomes less a scandal than a teacher, whispering lessons society never admitted it learned. And isn't it fitting that we end here, in memory itself? For memory is like a brothel's atmosphere, part truth, part illusion, part comfort, part longing. History remembers stern laws and moral sermons, but beneath them runs a softer current. The hum of innovation, the warmth of fire, the sweetness of late-night almonds, the daring of silk and song. So let us close the final curtain gently, leaving behind the painted walls and the faint perfume still lingering. May these whispers guide us into peaceful dreams, teaching us that even the strangest corners of history can shape the gentlest parts of our lives. And so, dear friend, our long wandering through Victorian nights comes to its quiet close. We have walked narrow alleys, sat by warm fires, dipped into scented baths, tasted sugared almonds at impossible hours, and listened to music that once belonged only to hidden parlours. We have traced how scandalous places shaped the soft comforts we now take for granted. Fresh linens, warm rooms, perfumes, late suppers, private laughter, gentle light. It is strange, isn't it, how history hides its teachers. The very places condemned by sermons and laws gave us the warmth of modern homes, the luxuries of travel, the rhythm of nightlife, the daring of art. Out of shadows grew comforts. Out of scandal grew rituals of peace. So as we close this story, let the echoes fade. The crackle of the hearth, the faint scent of rosewater, the hush of silk folding away. Let them drift like smoke, like memory, leaving only the calm weight of sleep. May these memories guide you now, not into worry or judgment, but into soft dreams. Dreams of candlelit rooms, of laughter just beyond hearing, of the city's fog lifting gently at dawn. If this quiet journey helped you drift, perhaps let me know below with just a word, a whisper, a sign. And if you'd like to wander again with me through other histories, other shadows, then press subscribe. Only if it feels right, only if it adds to your peace. For now, rest easy. Close your eyes. Let the night hold you gentle and warm. Sweet dreams, my friend. Sweet dreams, soft whisper. Boring History for Sleep signing off.